This is the seal of good practice. It identifies WCBS-TV as a subscriber to the television code of the National Association of Broadcasters. It assures you of high standards for the television programs designed to entertain and inform you. This is WCBS-TV in New York City, transmitting on Channel 2 by authority of the Federal Communications Commission. WCBS-TV is owned by the Columbia Broadcasting System, Incorporated, and operated by the CBS Television Stations Division. The programs of this station are broadcast for viewing by the public without charge, and may not be rebroadcast, recorded, or otherwise used without the prior written permission of the Columbia Broadcasting System. Our next regularly scheduled program will come to you at 6:15 a.m. Good morning.
CBS presents this program in color.
See the nice man? He is asleep beneath the tree. Everything is peaceful and serene. Do you know why it is always nice and peaceful here? It is make-believe. That is why. Real worlds are different. We know. We work against real cancer in the real world. Last year, over 200,000 people were cured of cancer. Annual checkups can help save thousands more. If only the people would come. See your doctor when you think everything is nice and rosy. That is smart. Do you know why we talk to you like this? Because when we talk to you like adults, you don't listen.
WCBS-TV, Television 3 in Norfolk, Virginia, now concludes another full day of night of broadcasting from its television and radio center on this street. This seal of the National Review Board of the National Association of Broadcasters is the symbol of good television. WCBS-TV subscribes to the high standards set forth in the TV code. To see the best TV, stay with Television 3.
On the ultra-high frequency band at an effective radiated power of 500 kilowatts, with transmitting facilities located at 29 Fort Greene Place in Brooklyn, New York. And now the staff and management of WNYE-TV Channel 25 wishes one and all a very good day.
Now WNYE-TV New York City, presenting educational, informational, and public service programming of special interest is about to leave the air. As part of the municipal broadcasting system, Channel 31 broadcasts on its own frequency of 572 to 578 gigahertz by authority of the Federal Communications Commission. The station operates under the direct supervision of Mayor John B. Lindsay as part of the Municipal Service Administration. It is direct between the FM receiving 93.9 megahertz to WNYC-FM, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We now give you good night. Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem.
The sun has made a veil of gold, so lovely that my body aches. Above the heavens shriek with blue, convinced I've smiled by some mistake. The world's abloom and seems to smile. I want to fly, but where, how high? If in barbed wire things can bloom, why can't I? I will not die. The children of barracks L318, Terezin concentration camp.
At Terezin once, there were 15,000 children. Now there are none. None because the world forgot to love, but remembered to hate. At Terezin, many died. But from that rubble, that shame, that hate, a lesson lives. Stand not idly by plight and poverty and oppression, but love thy neighbor as thyself. A simple rule, a simple lesson, if we would only listen.
Channel 2, New York. Give Us This Day, your daily inspirational message, presents Rabbi Martin Levin of Los Angeles, California.
Most interesting letters ever to come from a child to a newspaper writer appeared a number of years ago in the New York City Globe. It was addressed to Frank Crane, if you remember him. and contained the request, rather unusual, that he write in the paper and tell whether or not there is a God. "A man told me there isn't any," wrote the youngster. "I asked the teacher, and she said she doesn't know because some people say yes and others say no. Mama says there is, but Papa says he doesn't know much about such things. Some boys and I had a debate about it, and we thought we would ask you." Dr. Frank Crane found the request very challenging and believed it deserved a reply. And so shortly thereafter appeared the following in his newspaper. "Yes, my boy, there is a God. You can't see or hear him, but I will tell you how you can feel him. Did you ever lie or cheat, steal, or treat someone smaller than you rather cruelly? If so, you probably felt a hurt inside, some kind of miserable feeling in your heart, as if you were sick to your stomach. Sort of like having struck your finger with a hammer, except inside your heart and your mind. That was God that gives you the hurt. Have you ever wanted to do something mean or nasty, but resisted the desire, put it away from you, and instead acted honestly and fair? Have you noticed then a good feeling, a sense of inner pride and satisfaction? It is God that gives this good feeling when you feel you are doing things right. Have you ever looked up at the sky and remembering what you've been told about the vast distances between the stars, and that there are worlds just like ours moving through space as fast as cannonballs? Have you ever had a feeling of wonder of how great and majestic the universe is, and you are only a small part of it? That feeling of wonder and awe is a feeling that comes from God. A very wise man, Carlyle, said that worship is wonder, so that when you see anything that makes you wonder because of its greatness or beauty or mystery, you are really worshiping God, whether the object be the ocean, the mountain, or even a good person. "It's not the police that protect our lives, my boy," he wrote. "Only a few wicked people come into conflict with policemen. But there's something that holds every human being back from cruelty and things that are wrong. Something that stays the murderer's arm and causes many a woman to let herself go rather than be vile. That something is what we call God. None of us understands why God allows so many people to do wrong, but we do feel that there is something in every human being that makes wrongdoing bring some misery each and every time. The most important thing is to remember that God is not an enemy. God isn't a detective watching over us to punish you. Instead, God is a loving and serving force every minute of our lives."
That was Rabbi Martin Levin of Los Angeles, California. Give Us This Day was presented in cooperation with New York Board of Rabbis. This is the seal of good practice. It identifies WCBS-TV as a subscriber to the television code of the National Association of Broadcasters. This is WCBS-TV in New York City, transmitting on Channel 2 by authority of the Federal Communications Commission. WCBS-TV is owned by CBS Incorporated and operated by the CBS Television Stations Division. The programs broadcast by this station are for viewing by the public without charge and may not be rebroadcast, recorded, or otherwise used without the prior written permission of CBS Incorporated. Our next regularly scheduled program will come to you at 6:05 a.m. Good morning. Channel 2, New York.
Now, Jim Jensen, Carol Martin, Dr. Frank Field, and the Channel 2 News team. This is Channel 2 News at 5. Everything you need to know, because anything can happen in New York.
And leaving the airways after 62 years, WNBC Radio signs off. In just a few minutes, a change in call letters will signal the end to a signal radio fans have heard for years. It also signals the end of an era. At 5:30, a few seconds from now, WNBC AM will sign off for good. And while another station is taking over its position on the dial, listeners will not hear a sound that's been familiar for more than 6 decades. Correspondent Jane Velez-Mitchell was at Rockefeller Center on the day the music died.
I'm Alan Combs, and it's an honor to be asked to host the very last show on WNBC. We have a very big supply of tissues here in the studio.
All day, a sense of melancholy spilled out onto the airways of 660 WNBC. Radio personality Alan Combs used the station's final broadcast to reminisce with famous former DJs about one of America's most famous radio stations and its demise.
Are you at Radio Central on the 5th floor?
No, we used to be on 5. We're on 2 now.
Oh, well, you lost 3 floors.
It makes it easier to jump out the window this one.
There's more reason to. I'm appalled at the fact that the station's being discontinued.
It's a very bitter experience for me that WNBC will not be on my radio tomorrow morning.
When former WNBC DJ Cousin Brucey and others tune in to 660 AM, they'll hear instead WFAN, the sports station, which has been at 1050 on your AM dial. WNBC giant Don Imus is among the few making the hop to WFAN. They'll join the sports channel with its mix of Knicks, Rangers, and Mets games and sports talk.
WFAN, where the fan is first.
The rest of WNBC's crew, about 45 staffers, are out of work. NBC's parent company, General Electric, has decided to sell off its radio division of several stations around the country. Executives here say it's not been as profitable as other divisions. Today, despite attempts at a graduation party, the mood was clearly that of a wake. As boxes moved out, someone threw a noose out the window.
It just doesn't seem like it should be over. It's a tradition. There are so few left.
Though it's operated under the guise of a variety of call letters, this station has been on the air since 1922. Cousin Brucey is just one of many famous figures in entertainment who have gone out over these airwaves. Bob Hope, Jack Benny, and later on, Dr. Joyce Brothers, Don Imus, Howard Stern, Wolfman Jack, Soupy Sales, Ed McMahon, just to name a few. Now with FM strong, AM's hurting. Also, government rules may have forced GE to choose between owning TV or radio in New York. Execs believe the company opted for the profitable Channel 4 WNBC TV. For many radio fans, there are memories and the sound of silence. Jane Velez-Mitchell, Channel 2 News.
Missed from the airwaves, huh?
Can't believe it's
yeah,
over.
something. That's Channel 2 News at 5.
Tonight from Kabul, Afghanistan, more U.S. Marines and Army soldiers hit the ground and get ready to roll for a final assault on the Taliban, to hunt for Osama bin Laden, and to deliver humanitarian aid. We'll bring you complete coverage inside Afghanistan. Also tonight, the life and death of a music legend, the Beatles, George Harrison.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Continuing coverage of the war on terrorism. Reporting tonight from Kabul, Afghanistan, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening from Kabul, Afghanistan.
Another major story tonight is the passing of George Harrison. The former Beatle died in Los Angeles from cancer, his family by his side. He was 58 years old. Harrison's life and music reached for the same notes, inner strength and inner peace, and struck a chord with millions. CBS's Mark Phillips reports on the death and life of George Harrison.
There's a Beatles song for just about every occasion.
I read the news today, oh boy.
And today, the news was bad. They gathered at the John Lennon Memorial in New York to mark the death of another Beatle. And then there were two. George Harrison's death, unlike Lennon's, was neither sudden, nor violent, nor shocking. His religious conviction, he had said, expressed in his first solo hit single, had prepared him for death. Of all the Beatles, George Harrison hadn't been the brash one, or the cute one, or the funny one. He'd been the thoughtful one, seeking not fame, but answers.
The purpose of life is to find out who am I, why am I here, and where am I going. That's what we need answering.
And Harrison, as his friends knew, had found those answers.
I'm just privileged to have known him, and I love him like he's my brother. It was a very sad day for me and for a lot of other people.
It's a big cigarette for a big man.
George Harrison had had throat, then lung, then brain cancer. The cigarette gags, amusing when he was young, had long since stopped being funny. The man they called the reluctant Beatle is now getting the credit he is due. He was the musical backbone. His were the riffs the whole world played air guitar to. He led the group on its journey toward Eastern mysticism. And he, too, was the songwriter of enduring tunes. Even Sinatra called Something the best love song of the past 50 years. If the Beatles provided the soundtrack for a generation, Harrison provided the theme songs for his own life.
All things must pass. It doesn't take long to be from 17 to being 57. 40 years just goes like that.
In his life, George Harrison never saw himself as more than he was, a working-class rocker from Liverpool who was good enough and lucky enough to become famous around the world. More than guitars are gently weeping today. Mark Phillips, CBS News, London.
Next up on the Friday CBS Evening News, the political blame game heats up over the downturn in the U.S. economy.
Ronald Reagan, the Cold War crusader whose sunny optimism made a nation believe it was morning in America, dies at 93. The nation prepares to honor and remember the 40th President of the United States of America. Good evening. Former President Ronald Reagan died of pneumonia this afternoon at his home in California. His death brings to a close a remarkable life that bridged the worlds of entertainment, politics, and statesmanship. And the word of his passing comes on the very weekend that the United States and its allies are commemorating the 60th anniversary of the D-Day invasion in Normandy. We begin our coverage tonight with correspondent Jerry Bowen in Los Angeles.
Word of Mr. Reagan's rapidly failing health had been rumored for several days, and as reporters stood vigil at the gates of the Reagan home in Los Angeles, it was confirmed the 40th President of the United States had died after a nearly decade-long battle with Alzheimer's disease. At the Reagan Library, visitors mourned and remembered.
He set the country on the right course. I don't think that hasn't been a president before or since that really championed democracy throughout the world the way he did.
It was more than 9 years ago that Mr. Reagan revealed he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, adding in a handwritten letter, "I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience." Just last month at a fundraising dinner, Mrs. Reagan spoke of her nearly decade-long anguish.
Ronnie's long journey has finally taken him to a distant place where I can no longer reach him. We can't share the wonderful memories of our 52 years together, and I think that's probably the hardest part.
Mr. Reagan's body will lie in repose at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, before being flown to Washington to lie in state at the Capitol. After the state funeral at the National Cathedral, Mr. Reagan will make his last journey home to be buried at sunset on the grounds of his Hilltop Library. Tonight, in a printed statement, Nancy Reagan said, "My family and I would like the world to know that President Ronald Reagan has passed away after 10 years of Alzheimer's disease at 93 years of age. We appreciate everyone's prayers." Dan?
Jerry Bowen reporting live from Los Angeles. Thanks. President Bush, who will attend D-Day anniversary ceremonies tomorrow, was in Paris tonight when he was informed former President Ronald Reagan had died. In his first comments, President Bush called President Reagan's death, and I quote, "a sad day for America." Ronald Reagan's life and career spanned one of the most dramatic and tumultuous periods of U.S. history. It took Mr. Reagan from a humble birth in the small heartland town of Tampico, Illinois in 1911, all the way to the political summit with his victory over incumbent President Jimmy Carter in 1980. For Ronald Reagan, the presidency was the peak of a long life in the public eye. The oldest man ever elected to the White House, he was re-elected in 1984 with the greatest landslide in American history. People believed in his dream of restoring America's strength and pride in a time of doubt, and he had success.
Every promise, every opportunity is still golden in this land.
It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better.
The presidency was the role of a lifetime, but it was only one of many he played. They all had one thing in common. Ronald Reagan was all-American. He was a handsome lifeguard as a teenager in Illinois. After college, he became a radio sportscaster, known as Dutch Reagan.
Boys, this is Mr. George Gipp.
But his dream was to be a Hollywood actor, a star. He passed a screen test in 1937 and became a star in the role of George Gipp, the Gipper, in Newt Rockney. Ronald Reagan's first brush with politics came as president of the Screen Actors Guild. The hot issue was alleged communism in the film industry. Reagan took a moderate line before the investigating House Committee on Un-American Activities. In the mid to late 1950s, his politics began moving to the right. Later, as a spokesman for one of the country's biggest corporations, General Electric, he toured the country speaking on the evils of big government and high taxes. During this time, he divorced one Hollywood actress, Jane Wyman, and married another, Nancy Davis, who became his close advisor and most ardent political supporter. Reagan emerged as the hope of self-described conservatives all over America. First, he ran for governor of California and won big. After 2 terms as California governor, he took his first serious shot at the presidency in 1976, falling just a few votes short of possibly taking the nomination away from President Gerald Ford. 4 years later, he swept the Republican primaries and the convention.
CBS News special report, the presidential debate.
Then he dueled successfully in debate with Democratic President Jimmy Carter. And on Election Day, he beat Carter at the polls.
And will to the best of my ability.
Reagan's inauguration was a watershed for America.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
As he took the oath, a suddenly and only briefly cooperative Iran released 52 American hostages Iran had held for more than a year. His first order of business is what he saw as a revolution in the American economy.
I shall ask for a 10% reduction across the board in personal income tax rates for each of the next 3 years.
But barely 2 months into his first term, Reagan was shot by would-be assassin John Hinckley. Only a quick dash to the hospital saved his life. Just 4 weeks later,
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
He addressed Congress. He was more popular than ever, and what became known as the Reagan Revolution was underway. President Reagan nominated the first woman to the United States Supreme Court. He dealt a devastating blow to union labor when he broke the air controllers' strike by setting a deadline, then firing them all. To the dismay of the Soviets and many who described themselves as peace lovers in America, Reagan proposed his Star Wars scheme, a multi-billion-dollar effort which he called a defensive shield against nuclear weapons in space. It wasn't until his second term that he met with the Soviet leader. But in 1985, he and Mikhail Gorbachev began a partnership that culminated in the first arms treaty to actually reduce the number of nuclear weapons.
I never took a penny that didn't belong to me.
Later, he was embarrassed by a national security aide, Oliver North, and others, who admitted secretly trading arms to Iran, diverting the proceeds via Swiss banks to Nicaraguan Contras, and lying to Congress to cover it all up. Investigators said President Reagan approved at least some of these secret dealings, but he pleaded ignorance.
I did not know what had happened or whether there had been a diversion or any money to divert.
What became known as the Iran-Contra scandal tarnished his second term, but did not destroy his popularity. Ronald Reagan left office with the economy booming. A recession was right around the corner, but as he left, the economy was up, the deficit was soaring, and his public approval rating was higher than any other modern president. In 1994, he revealed he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He wrote a farewell letter to the American people saying, "I now begin the journey that will take me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead." CBS will have more on the life and times of former President Ronald Reagan later in this broadcast, and, please note, in a special tribute to Ronald Reagan later this evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central. Up next, John Robertson, Normandy, with the heroes of D-Day. Finally tonight, when many Americans look back at the life of Ronald Reagan, they don't just remember the account of his 2 terms as president, they also remember his leading roles on the silver screen. John Blackstone now with an appreciation of Ronald Reagan, actor.
Good evening, everybody. This is Andy McCain with some right off the grid.
Ronald Reagan wasn't headed for Hollywood when he headed west in 1937, and it wasn't for the movie, it was for radio.
Here are the Chicago Cubs and Avalon.
Sent by his Iowa radio to cover the Chicago Cubs spring training on Catalina Island. But a friend introduced him to an agent who got him a screen test, which won him a meeting at Warner Brothers with Jack Warner himself.
What was it, Mr. Warner, that caught your eye when you looked at that first test of Reagan?
Well, he had his personality projected in what we, as I term it, off the screen into the audience. It come through. He had a good smile, happy delivery.
Hello, Holly, want to hear some good news?
That film persona, the good-looking, all-American, easy-going guy, fit him like a glove. And he fit right in at the film factory, eventually churning out more than 50 pictures, 8 in 1938 alone.
Ben, where are we, my friend?
High and dry. That's right.
Reagan called himself the Errol Flynn of the B-movies. But the truth is, he mostly didn't get the girl.
Yeah, it's Judy. You know, Doc, I've loved her for a long time, but I can't help her now because, well, you're the one man, so be nice to her, will you?
But he did get a wife.
Just something I forgot to do in the rose garden.
His first, Jane woman. And he did play bit parts in A movies with the biggest stars of the day, movie after movie, year after year. Regarded not as a star, but steady. His career got a big boost from a supporting role. Football legend George Gipp in Newt Ruckney, All-American.
Rock. Someday when the team's up against it, breaks are beating the boys. Ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Kipper.
But there were always movies. Even as president, watched hundreds of movies, mostly at Camp David over big bowls of popcorn. And if too many people wondered if an actor could or should be president, Reagan didn't. The acting was just part of the picture. At his museum in Southern California, the Hollywood years are relegated to just one wall, because for most actors, Hollywood is a pinnacle. For Ronald Reagan, it was a prelude. John Blackstone, CBS News, Hollywood.
As president, Ronald Reagan tried so often to remind us that from we the people, not need to be said the government, would come the solutions to our greatest problems. He asked a nation to find within itself the greatness that he considered its birthright, and he sought to make us equal to the task by reminding us of our collective heritage. Reagan was the great communicator, yes, but was also a master at communicating greatness. He understood that, as he once put it, history is a ribbon always unfurling, and managed to convey his vision in terms both simple and poetic. And so he was able to act as a conduit to connect us to who we had been and who we could be. That's part of our world tonight. CBS will be back later tonight with a special broadcast, the life and death of former President Ronald Reagan. That special broadcast begins at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 Central. Until that special broadcast, Dan Rather, CBS News in New York. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, click on CBSNews.com. Brought to you in part by...
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
the
office of President of the United States.
Ronald Reagan's life was an American dream.
He looked presidential. He acted presidentially. He had dignity.
From Hollywood,
win just one for the Kipper,
to the world age.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The great communicator with that great sense of humor.
One of my favorite quotations about age comes from Thomas Jefferson. He said that we should never judge a president by his age, only by his work. And ever since he told me that, I've stopped worrying.
Tonight, echoes of history.
I didn't know I shot. In fact, I was still asking, what was that noise? I thought it was firecrackers.
An intimate portrait of our 40th president.
If you will look over his life, somehow he got everything he wanted.
President Ronald Reagan, remembered.
This is a CBS News special report. Ronald Reagan, the death of a president. From New York, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. Tonight, we remember Ronald Wilson Reagan. The 40th President of the United States died today in Los Angeles. He was 93 years old. The official cause of death, pneumonia. But the former president had been battling Alzheimer's disease for 10 years. With him, when the end came, his Bel Air, California home was his caregiver in his final years, former First Lady Nancy Reagan, and their children, Ron and Patty. Reagan became president in 1981. CBS News correspondent Leslie Stahl covered the Reagan White House.
Ronald Reagan strode into the American presidency on that sunny January day in 1981 like the moral, good guy sheriff we'd seen him play in the movies.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will...
He looked presidential. He acted presidentially. He had dignity.
Edmund Morris, Ronald Reagan's biographer, was given unprecedented access in the White House. He took me back to the president's boyhood home in Illinois, where he says he first began to figure him out.
I always feel that when he was president, that his largest mission in life was the moral leadership of the United States.
He says Ronald Reagan saw himself as a savior with a mission to tame the government, get it off the backs of the American people. And he wanted to make sure that the United States loomed large on the world stage. Gone was the Carter administration and the melees it had come to stand for. Brandishing his landslide, Ronald Reagan ran all that out of town. And he did it quickly. In fact, by lunchtime on his inauguration day.
So we can all drink to this one.
The new president was able to announce what America had waited 444 days to hear.
Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
52 Americans held hostage by Iranian militants would be coming home. Though there's no evidence he had anything to do with securing their release, Ronald Reagan was the beneficiary. He got right down to business.
And I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day.
Proposing massive tax cuts and deep spending reductions, which the Democrats criticized as trickle-down economics and welfare for the rich. But the wrangling and political backbiting stopped cold when a gunman opened fire, an assassination attempt. It was just 3 months into the presidency.
I didn't know I was shot. In fact, I was still asking, what was that noise? I thought it was firecrackers.
The bullets from John Hinckley's gun missed the president's heart by an inch. He almost died. And you write about how this changed him.
He became, for the first time in his life, spiritual. He felt that he had been spared, and everything he did after that, he did with the sense that it was for the permanent good of the United States.
The shooting made Ronald Reagan a hero and helped him restore power to the presidency.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
His proposal to cut government and taxes passed in the first 100 days of his presidency.
If you will look back over his life, you will notice that somehow he got everything he wanted. He always prevailed.
To see you.
He was charming and appealing. A movie star turned president, up to his reputation as the great communicator as when he commemorated the 40th anniversary of D-Day on the beach at Normandy.
We stand on a lonely, windswept point on the northern shore of France. And liftoff.
A space shuttle Challenger's astronauts, including a schoolteacher, died before the world's eyes. He led the country in communal mourning.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
When it came to his enemies, he rode them hard, like the Soviet Union, which he called the evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call...
I was there when he did his evil empire speech. And it was breathtaking, and he was really greatly criticized for this.
Well, a lot of Russians will tell you that when he used that language, that biblical language, the evil empire, that was when they, for the first time, began to accept the fact that they were indeed an evil system.
The president asked Congress for an additional $180 billion in defense spending. He put mid-range nuclear missiles in Europe and aimed them at Moscow. When it came to the Russians, it was always high noon.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
He understood the power of images. Only one person could stand in front of it and say that and not give the impression of hokiness.
In your book, do you give him credit for basically ending the Soviet Union?
I certainly think that if it was not for his moral confrontation with the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev.
And still they come. Tonight, Americans by the thousands from every walk of life wait hours to pay last respects to President Reagan. They'll tell you why. Was Libya's Muammar Gaddafi plotting to assassinate a world leader even as he was renouncing terrorism? We'll tell you about an alleged plot. An important decision by the Bush administration could affect your telephone bill. We'll give you the inside story. And the passing of an American original. Remembering the soulful genius of Ray Charles.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting tonight from Washington.
Good evening, and once again we are just across from the Capitol, where something remarkable has been going on all day. It is still going on right now. Eulogies for President Reagan at the National Memorial Service tomorrow morning at the National Cathedral here in Washington. There is mourning tonight for another American of humble origins who, like Ronald Reagan, rose to greatness and became one of the most beloved figures of his time. Ray Charles died today in California of liver failure. He was 73. Ray Charles was a master of American music, from jazz to country, gospel to pop, and he blended them into something new. He called it soul. Jim Axelrod has his soulful story.
In his own way, Ray Charles made as many American chests swell with pride as that other American icon being mourned tonight. And his story is every bit the Horatio Alger rags to riches American success tale. A son of the American South, Ray Charles Robinson was born poor, was blind by 7, and orphaned at 15.
When you start out with 0, you know what it is to be poor. You know what it is to be hungry. Oh, what you trying to do to me? I just need you, baby.
He went on to win a dozen Grammys, make millions, and shape the culture of the country he loved.
We do have the freedom to say things we want to say, and we can, if we have the will and the drive, we can pretty much make ourselves become whatever.
Ray Charles did more than just entertain for 57 years. He cross-pollinated American music. During one week in 1962, he was #1 on the country, R&B, and pop charts, all at the same time.
Hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack.
Brother Ray had his deep sorrows and his demons, battling heroin for years. His saving grace was a refusal to wallow in self-pity. Glaucoma took his sight, not his soul.
I look at blindness like an inconvenience. I can do 98% of everything I want to do in my life.
And whatever hardship robbed, his music seemed to restore.
Music really and truly is my bloodstream, you know, my breathing, my respiratory system, I guess. For me, it is living. For me, there ain't no retiring until the day when they put me away.
And not even then.
He has one more album of new material set for release next month. Ray Charles was simply too big an American legend to suddenly go silent for good. Jim Axelrod, CBS News, New York.
Coming up next on the CBS Evening News, your phone bill. It may soon be going up. We'll tell you why in tonight's Inside Story. And then later, they started as foes, ended as friends. How Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev worked together to end the Cold War. CBS's special series, The Legacy.
This is a CBS News special report. The President's farewell address to the nation. Here is Katie Couric.
And good evening, everyone. George W. Bush has been President of the United States for 2,918 days. Tonight, 5 days before he leaves office, Mr. Bush will sum up his 2 terms in the White House and say goodbye in his final address to the American people, delivered from the historic East Room. The audience there will include the First Lady, Vice President and Mrs. Cheney, and some special people the President has met during his time in office. People who have demonstrated great acts of courage and compassion Mr. Bush found inspiring. The President will lay out what he sees as his accomplishments over the past 8 years and the challenges that lie ahead for the next president. Mr. Bush will note that America has not had a terror attack in the more than 7 years since 9/11. But he will also say we must never let down our guard. The farewell address is a tradition started by George Washington, though not every president has necessarily followed that tradition. Most recently, Presidents Clinton, Reagan, and Carter summed up their administrations in farewell addresses from the Oval Office. As we said, it will take place in the East Room. He is the 43rd President of the United States, and here he is, George W. Bush.
Thank you. Fellow citizens, for 8 years it has been my honor to serve as your president. The first decade of this new century has been a period of consequence, a time set apart. Tonight, with a thankful heart, I have asked for a final opportunity to share some thoughts on the journey that we have traveled together and the future of our nation. 5 days from now, the world will witness the vitality of American democracy. In a tradition dating back to our founding, the presidency will pass to a successor chosen by you, the American people. Standing on the steps of the Capitol will be a man whose history reflects the enduring promise of our land. This is a moment of hope and pride for our whole nation. And I join all Americans in offering best wishes to President-elect Obama, his wife Michelle, and their 2 beautiful girls. Tonight I'm filled with gratitude to Vice President Cheney and members of my administration, to Laura, who brought joy to this house and love to my life, to our wonderful daughters, Barbara and Jenna, to my parents whose examples have provided strength for a lifetime. And above all, I thank the American people for the trust you have given me. I thank you for the prayers that have lifted my spirits. And I thank you for the countless acts of courage, generosity, and grace that I have witnessed these past 8 years. This evening, my thoughts return to the first night I addressed you from this house, September the 11th, 2001. That morning, terrorists took nearly 3,000 lives in the worst attack on America since Pearl Harbor. I remember standing in the rubble of the World Trade Center 3 days later, surrounded by rescuers who had been working around the clock. I remember talking to brave souls who charged through smoke-filled corridors at the Pentagon, and to husbands and wives whose loved ones became heroes aboard Flight 93. I remember Arlene Howard, who gave me her fallen son's police shield as a reminder of all that was lost, and I still carry his badge. As the years passed, most Americans were able to return to life much as it had been before 9/11. But I never did. Every morning, I received a briefing on the threats to our nation. I vowed to do everything in my power to keep us safe. Over the past 7 years, a new Department of Homeland Security has been created. The military, the intelligence community, and the FBI have been transformed. Our nation is equipped with new tools to monitor the terrorist movements, freeze their finances, and break up their plots. And with strong allies at our side, we have taken the fight to the terrorists and those who support them. Afghanistan has gone from a nation where the Taliban harbored al-Qaeda and stoned women in the streets to a young democracy that is fighting terror and encouraging girls to go to school. Iraq has gone from a brutal dictatorship and a sworn enemy of America to an Arab democracy at the heart of the Middle East and a friend of the United States. There's legitimate debate about many of these decisions, but there can be little debate about the results. America has gone more than 7 years without another terrorist attack on our soil. This is a tribute to those who toil night and day to keep us safe: law enforcement officers, intelligence analysts, Homeland Security and diplomatic personnel, and the men and women of the United States Armed Forces. Our nation is blessed to have citizens who volunteered to defend us in this time of danger. I have cherished meeting these selfless patriots and their families, and America owes you a debt of gratitude. And to all our men and women in uniform listening tonight, there has been no higher honor than serving as your commander-in-chief. The battles waged by our troops are part of a broader struggle between two dramatically different systems. Under one, a small band of fanatics demands total obedience to an oppressive ideology, condemns women to subservience, and marks unbelievers for murder. The other system is based on the conviction that freedom is the universal gift of Almighty God, and that liberty and justice light the path to peace. This is the belief that gave birth to our nation, and in the long run, advancing this belief is the only practical way to protect our citizens. When people live in freedom, they do not willingly choose leaders who pursue campaigns of terror. When people have hope in the future, they will not cede their lives to violence and extremism. So around the world, America is promoting human liberty, human rights, and human dignity. We're standing with dissidents and young democracies, providing AIDS medicine to dying patients, to bring dying patients back to life, and sparing mothers and babies from malaria. And this great republic, born alone in liberty, is leading the world toward a new age when freedom belongs to all nations. For 8 years, we've also strived to expand opportunity and hope here at home. Across our country, students are rising to meet higher standards in public schools. A new Medicare prescription drug benefit is bringing peace of mind to seniors and the disabled. Every taxpayer pays lower income taxes. The addicted and suffering are finding new hope through faith-based programs. Vulnerable human life is better protected. Funding for our veterans has nearly doubled. America's air and water and lands are measurably cleaner. And the federal bench includes wise new members like Justice Sam Alito and Chief Justice John Roberts. When challenges to our prosperity emerged, we rose to meet them. Facing the prospect of a financial collapse, we took decisive measures to safeguard our economy. These are very tough times for hard-working families, but the toll would be far worse if we had not acted. All Americans are in this together, and together, with determination and hard work, we will restore our economy to the path of growth. We will show the world once again the resilience of America's free enterprise system. Like all who have held this office before me, I have experienced setbacks. And there are things I would do differently if given the chance. Yet I've always acted with the best interests of our country in mind. I have followed my conscience and done what I thought was right. You may not agree with some of the tough decisions I have made, but I hope you can agree that I was willing to make the tough decisions. The decades ahead will bring more hard choices for our country, and there are some guiding principles that should shape our course. While our nation is safer than it was 7 years ago, the gravest threat to our people remains another terrorist attack. Our enemies are patient and determined to strike again. America did nothing to seek or deserve this conflict, but we have been given solemn responsibilities, and we must meet them. We must resist complacency We must keep our resolve, and we must never let down our guard. At the same time, we must continue to engage the world with confidence and clear purpose. In the face of threats from abroad, it can be tempting to seek comfort by turning inward. But we must reject isolationism and its companion, protectionism. Retreating behind our borders would only invite danger. In the 21st century, security and prosperity at home depend on the expansion of liberty abroad. If America does not lead the cause of freedom, that cause will not be led. As we address these challenges and others we cannot foresee tonight, America must maintain our moral clarity. I've often spoken to you about good and evil, and this has made some uncomfortable. But good and evil are present in this world, and between the two, there can be no compromise. Murdering the innocent to advance an ideology is wrong every time, everywhere. Freeing people from oppression and despair is eternally right. This nation must continue to speak out for justice and truth. We must always be willing to act in their defense and to advance the cause of peace. President Thomas Jefferson once wrote, "I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past." As I leave the house he occupied 2 centuries ago, I share that optimism. America is a young country, full of vitality, constantly growing and renewing itself. And even in the toughest times, we lift our eyes to the broad horizon ahead. I have confidence in the promise of America because I know the character of our people. This is a nation that inspires immigrants to risk everything for the dream of freedom. This is a nation where citizens show calm in times of danger and compassion in the face of suffering. We see examples of America's character all around us. And Laura and I have invited some of them to join us in the White House this evening. We see America's character in Dr. Tony Rekasner, a principal who opened a new charter school from the ruins of Hurricane Katrina. We see it in Julio Medina, a former inmate who leads a faith-based program to help prisoners returning to society. We see it in Staff Sergeant Aubrey McDade, who charged into an ambush in Iraq and rescued 3 of his fellow Marines. We see America's character in Bill Krisoff, a surgeon from California. His son, Nathan, a Marine, gave his life in Iraq. When I met Dr. Krisoff and his family, he delivered some surprising news. He told me he wanted to join the Navy Medical Corps in honor of his son. This good man was 60 years old, 18 years above the age limit. But his petition for a waiver was granted, and for the past year he has trained in battlefield medicine. Lieutenant Commander Krisoff could not be here tonight because he will soon deploy to Iraq, where he will help save America's wounded warriors and uphold the legacy of his fallen son. In citizens like these, we see the best of our country, resilient and hopeful, caring and strong. These virtues give me an unshakable faith in America. We have faced danger and trial, and there's more ahead. But with the courage of our people and confidence in our ideals, this great nation will never tire, never falter, and never fail. It has been the privilege of a lifetime to serve as your president. There have been good days and tough days. But every day I have been inspired by the greatness of our country and uplifted by the goodness of our people. I have been blessed to represent this nation we love, and I will always be honored to carry a title that means more to me than any other: citizen of the United States of America. And so, my fellow Americans, for the final time, good night. May God bless this House and our next president, and may God bless you and our wonderful country. Thank you.
So George W. Bush says an emotional goodbye to the nation after 8 years as President of the United States. There will be more about his farewell address on your late local news on this CBS station and first thing tomorrow on The Early Show. I'm Katie Couric, CBS News, New York. This is a CBS News special report. I'm Katie Couric. Good evening. It is my sad duty to tell you that our friend and colleague Walter Cronkite has died. He was 92 and passed away peacefully tonight here in New York. Walter became anchor here at CBS when television news was in its infancy and brought generations of Americans the most momentous events of the second half of the 20th century, from the assassination of a president to a man's landing on the moon.
And that's the way it is. And that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is.
That's the way it is.
For half a century, Walter Cronkite told it the way it was, delivering the news straight and unvarnished.
Evening, everyone. Here is the news.
Among the pioneers who built television news from the ground up, he forged a special bond with audiences. Trustworthy, plain-spoken, unflappable.
And you were there.
Walter was there. He had lived the history of the century and reported it. Born in 1916 in St. Joseph, Missouri. As a young man growing up in Houston and Kansas City, he saw firsthand the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and the Great Depression. As a young wire service reporter in World War II, he hit the ground with troops in North Africa and was the first to make it back with the story.
I'm just back from the biggest assignment that any American reporter could have so far in this war.
He was all of 26, a natural, before the camera and the microphone. He covered the Nuremberg war crime trials, sitting just a few feet from the Nazi architects of the Holocaust.
Some of them were sniveling. Gosh, you couldn't stand them. Stryker, Jew baiter, terrible man. You wanted to get up there and personally cut his throat. Hess was obviously mad as a hatter. Absolutely insane.
In the early 1950s, television came calling. Walter anchored the news on CBS, first in Washington, then on the network from New York. As television began taking wing in the 1950s, so did Walter, covering the coronation of Queen Elizabeth.
She's to be crowned Britain's sixth reigning queen.
An atomic device. Atom bomb testing in Nevada, the birth of the American space program.
Fire at the apogee to raise the perigee.
Walter knew 12 American presidents.
I've met all of America's presidents since Herbert Hoover, and I've known some of them pretty well. Lyndon Johnson called the CBS Evening News while I was actually on the air and insisted that they put him through to me on the air. The secretary said, but he's on the air, Mr. President. I don't give a damn where he is. Put him on the phone.
He assumed the anchor chair of the evening news in 1962.
Good evening from the CBS News Control Center in New York. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
Supreme Court today legalized abortion.
A flurry of activity at the Jack Ruby trial.
The risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island atomic power plant.
And he was with us during America's darkest moments.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
And I almost lost it there.
There has been a display of naked violence in the streets of downtown Chicago. The witness to that Hilton violence...
Cronkite was a fixture at political conventions, including the Democrats' chaotic meeting in Chicago in 1968, a party in a country at war with itself over Vietnam. Walter's skepticism grew while reporting on the Vietnam War. He shared those feelings in a landmark broadcast in which he acknowledged he was stating his opinion that it was time for the nation to withdraw.
But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
After that report, I recall that LBJ said to many of us that if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war.
Countdown is at 2 minutes.
But his personal passion was space.
I think that our conquest of space will probably be the most important story of the whole 20th century.
Looks like a good flight. Oh, go, baby.
In 1969, a waiting world held its breath as man first approached the surface of the moon.
The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
Oh, boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy for a minute.
When that vehicle landed on the moon, I was speechless. I really couldn't say a thing.
It's a measure of the man that he preferred the triumphs of the space program to the despair in so much of the news.
I mean, at a time when there were a lot of other problems in this country and elsewhere, people were downcast. Everybody there was upcast. We were looking toward the stars, looking toward the moon. There was a spirit that was absolutely incomparable.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News. For me, it's a moment for which I long have planned, but which nevertheless comes with some sadness.
His own spirit was unconquerable. After leaving the evening news, he traveled well into his 80s, making documentaries and enjoying himself. In 1996, he told us how he felt about the amazing century he had witnessed.
If there's anything I've learned, it is that we Americans do have a way of rising to the challenges that confront us. Just when it seems we're most divided, we suddenly show our remarkable solidarity. The 20th century may be leaving us with a host of problems, but I've also noted that it does seem darkest before the dawn. There's reason to hope for the 21st century, and that's the way it will be.
So, to repeat, if you're just tuning in, longtime CBS News anchor and journalism giant Walter Cronkite has died at the age of 92. There will be much more about him on upcoming CBS News broadcasts and on a primetime CBS News special, That's the Way It Was, Remembering Walter Cronkite, Sunday evening at 7, 6 Central. I'm Kitty Couric, CBS News, New York.
I have some questions. I'm hoping the two of you have some answers.
This is WCBS-TV, New York. WCBS-TV broadcasts on Channel 2 by the authority of the Federal Communications Commission. WCBS-TV is owned by CBS Incorporated and is operated by the CBS Television Stations Division. WCBS-TV will cease broadcasting regular analog programming on Channel 2, permanently effective with this sign-off. The next regularly scheduled broadcast on WCBS-TV Analog will be Nightlight Public Service Announcements at 3 p.m. Good day. Good afternoon. This is WCBS TV. WCBS TV is owned and operated by CBS Incorporated. This station will operate for the next 30 days as a nightlight station only for the New York area. The only programming that will be present is information regarding the switch to digital television and where you can obtain assistance.
Pick up channels 2 through 13, while UHF-only antennas, like this silver sensor model, only pick up channels 14 and higher. That's why you need a good VHF-UHF antenna to get all the channels out there. The location of an indoor antenna in the room also makes a big difference to how well it receives DTV channels, and you may need to try different locations to get the best reception. Raising it as high as possible is usually best, and you will also need to try changing the location in which it is pointing. An alternative is to use an outdoor or rooftop antenna, which generally works better than indoor antennas. The higher an antenna is placed and the larger it is, the better it is.
It's a CBS News special report. Good evening. I'm Scott Pelley. We have some sad news tonight from within our CBS News family. Our 60 Minutes colleague Bob Simon was killed this evening. It was a car accident in New York City. The veteran correspondent has been with 60 Minutes since 1996, and he is renowned for his international coverage. Vietnam is where he first began covering warfare, and he gave us first-hand reporting from virtually every major battlefield around the world since. During the beginning of the first Gulf War in 1991, Bob and his CBS News crew were captured and detained as POWs for 40 days in Iraqi prisons. His body of work earned Bob too many journalistic honors to count here tonight. Bob's daughter, Tanya, is a talented producer for 60 Minutes, and tonight our thoughts are with Tanya and Bob's family and his many, many friends. Our colleague, Bob Simon of 60 Minutes, was 73 years old. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Scott Pelley.